The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles for what would become the most crucial reconnaissance mission of his career. It was June 2nd, 1942, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, hiding beneath its deceptively peaceful surface the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in the operations room at Pearl Harbor, his weathered hands gripping the edge of a table covered with charts and intelligence reports. The weight of the Pacific War rested on his shoulders, and he knew that the next few days would determine whether America would continue its desperate defensive struggle or finally seize the initiative against the Empire of Japan. The intelligence intercepts from Station HYPO had been clear. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was bringing the combined fleet to Midway Atoll, intent on drawing out the remaining American carrier forces and destroying them in one decisive battle. 300 miles northwest of Midway, aboard the flagship Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda reviewed his attack plans one final time. The same man who had led the devastating assault on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, now prepared for what Japanese high command believed would be the final blow against American naval power in the Pacific. Fukuda's pilots, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, displayed the quiet confidence of warriors who had known nothing but victory since the war began. The irony was not lost on the American commanders that they were about to make their stand at Midway, a tiny speck of coral and sand that most Americans had never heard of before December 7th, 1941. Yet this remote outpost, barely 2 miles across, had become the focal point for the largest naval battle in history. Captain Miles Browning, Admiral Raymond Spruance Chief of Staff aboard the Enterprise, understood that American naval aviation would either prove itself worthy of the legacy it claimed or be swept from the Pacific forever. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations. In World War II, the strategic importance of Midway extended far beyond its geographic position. The atoll represented America's last defensive barrier before Hawaii itself, and its loss would have opened the entire Pacific coast to Japanese attack. Aboard the USS Yorktown, damage control teams worked frantically to complete repairs that should have taken months. The carrier had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea, her flight deck scarred and her hull wounded, but Admiral Nimitz had ordered her back to sea within 72 hours. Chief Petty Officer John Snowden supervised the installation of new steel plates, knowing that his rush work might mean the difference between life and death for 3,000 sailors. The Japanese plan, Operation Me, was ambitious in its scope and devastating in its intended consequences. Yamamoto envisioned a complex operation that would simultaneously capture Midway Atoll and destroy the American Pacific Fleet, for aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would spearhead the attack, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in numbers that dwarfed the American force, yet in the quiet confidence of Japanese planning lay the seeds of tactical inflexibility that would prove fatal. As darkness fell on June 2nd, both fleets moved toward their rendezvous with destiny, each commander believing that victory lay within their grasp, neither fully understanding that the next 4 days would reshape the entire Pacific War. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the first Kawanishi flying boat lifted off from the Marshall Islands, beginning the reconnaissance sweep that would officially commence the Battle of Midway. The pre-dawn darkness concealed movements that would determine the fate of nations. As Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's striking force approached Midway from the northwest, while Admiral Spruance's Task Force 16 and Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17 moved to intercept from positions northeast of the atoll. Ensign Jack Reed, piloting APBY Catalina flying boat from Midway, peered through the morning haze at 5:25, searching for the Japanese fleet he knew must be approaching. When he finally spotted the dark silhouettes of enemy warships on the horizon, his radio call electrified every American command post in the Pacific. Enemy carriers bearing 30 degrees, distance 180 miles. The battle for Midway had begun. Aboard the Akagi, Commander Fukuda felt the familiar tension that preceded every major operation as 108 aircraft prepared for launch. The first wave would suppress Midway's defenses, clearing the way for the invasion force scheduled to arrive the following day. Zero fighters, Nakajima Cape torpedo bombers, and Aichi Val dive bombers crowded the carrier's deck, their engines warming in the tropical morning air. At 600 hours, the first aircraft roared down the flight deck, beginning what Japanese planners expected would be the final chapter of American resistance in the Central Pacific. The American response from Midway came swiftly, but with tragic consequences. Major Lofton Henderson led 16 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers off the island's single runway, knowing that his hastily trained Marine pilots faced overwhelming odds against the experienced Japanese carrier air groups. Henderson's squadron found Nagumo's carriers, but paid a devastating price for their courage. Henderson himself was shot down during the attack, becoming one of the first casualties in what would be remembered as one of aviation's bloodiest days. As referenced in Walter Lord's definitive account Incredible Victory, the morning's air battles demonstrated both American determination and the tactical superiority that Japanese naval aviation had maintained since Pearl Harbor. At 705 hours, Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen launched 27 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and 7 Grumman Wildcat fighters to intercept the Japanese strike approaching Midway. The aerial combat that followed showcased the lethal effectiveness of the Mitsubishi Zero, as Japanese pilots systematically destroyed American aircraft with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, 23 American fighters had been shot down, their smoking wreckage scattered across the Pacific. The Japanese first wave, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, reached Midway at 6:20 and found the island's defenders ready for battle. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire as Japanese bombers swept across the atoll, targeting the airfield, fuel storage facilities, and command posts. Despite the intensity of the attack, Midway's essential facilities remained operational, prompting Tomonaga to radio back to Admiral Nagumo, "Second attack necessary." This single message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history. Nagumo faced a critical decision. His second-wave aircraft were already armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against American ships, but Tomonaga's request suggested that anti-ship ordnance should be replaced with general-purpose bombs for a second strike against Midway. At 7:15, Nagumo made the fatal choice to rearm his aircraft for a second attack on the island. Bombs and torpedoes cluttered the hangar decks as ordnance crews worked frantically to complete the changeover. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that American carrier aircraft, launched hours earlier from positions northeast of Midway, began their approach toward the Japanese fleet. Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, understood the desperate nature of his mission as he guided 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers toward the enemy carriers. These obsolete aircraft, slow and poorly armed, would have to penetrate the Japanese defensive screen and deliver their weapons at point-blank range. Waldron's determination would soon be tested in the most unforgiving arena of modern warfare. At 7:37 on the morning of June 4th, Commander John Waldron's voice crackled over the radio to his 14 fellow pilots. "In Torpedo Squadron 8, we will go in. We won't turn back. We'll attack. Wish me luck." These would be among the last words heard from most of the squadron as they began their approach toward Admiral Nagumo's carrier force, now clearly visible on the horizon. As for dark shapes surrounded by the white wakes of their escorts, the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of Squadron 8 flew at wave top level, their crews knowing that their obsolete aircraft offered little chance of survival against the formidable Japanese defenses. As they approached the carriers, Mitsubishi Zero fighters dove from above while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. With deadly black puffs of smoke, one by one, the American torpedo bombers began falling into the Pacific, their crews disappearing beneath the waves as Japanese pilots pressed home their attacks with ruthless efficiency. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. His own aircraft, riddled with bullets and losing altitude rapidly, crashed into the ocean just short of the Japanese carriers. Gay managed to inflate his life raft and hide beneath it, becoming an unwitting witness to the day's most crucial events. From his position in the water, he would observe the entire battle unfold, watching as both American heroism and Japanese overconfidence shaped the outcome of the war's most decisive engagement. The carnage continued as torpedo squadrons from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown followed similar attack patterns with equally devastating results. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, only to watch as his formation was systematically destroyed by Japanese fighters. Of the 14 aircraft that began the attack, only 4 survived to return to their carrier, and none had managed to score a hit on the enemy's ships. As documented in Gordon Prange's exhaustive research Miracle at Midway, the morning's torpedo attacks, while tactically unsuccessful, served a crucial strategic purpose by drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupting The timing of Nagumo's planned operations, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's torpedo squadron, 3 from the Yorktown, met a similar fate, with 10 of 12 aircraft shot down in the space of minutes. The sky above the Japanese carriers had become a killing field, where American courage met Japanese tactical superiority in the most unforgiving terms. Yet these seemingly futile attacks were achieving something that their crews could never have imagined. They were setting the stage for one of naval aviation's greatest victories. At 9:20, as the last American torpedo bomber fell burning into the Pacific, Admiral Nagumo believed he had successfully repelled the American attack. His carriers remained undamaged, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for the anticipated strike against the American carriers that his scouts had finally located. The Japanese admiral felt confident that he had weathered the worst of American air power and could now concentrate on delivering the decisive blow that would eliminate American naval aviation from the Pacific theater. What Nagumo could not see from his position on Akagi's bridge were the 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers approaching from high altitude, their crews having spent the morning searching for the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had made a critical navigation decision that brought him to the Japanese carriers, just as their defenses were concentrated on the low-altitude torpedo attacks. The stage was set for the most dramatic reversal in naval warfare history. Below, Japanese carriers sat exposed and vulnerable, their fighter cover drawn down to sea level, their decks cluttered with fuel lines and ordnance. Above, American dive bombers began their attack runs, diving from 14,000 feet toward targets that would determine whether Japan or America would control the Pacific for the remainder of the war. The morning slaughter of American torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. Their sacrifice had created the conditions for victory, though few of the men who died in those desperate low-level attacks would live to see their contribution recognized. In the space of the next 6 minutes, the entire Pacific War would be transformed from a defensive struggle into an offensive campaign that would carry American forces across thousands of miles of ocean to the Japanese home islands themselves. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,000 feet above the Japanese carrier Kaga, beginning what would become known as the most decisive 6 minutes in Pacific naval warfare. Behind him, 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise followed in formation, their crews finally having found the Japanese carriers after hours of fruitless searching. Across empty ocean, the scene below on the Japanese carriers was one of barely controlled chaos. Admiral Nagumo had spent the morning making and remaking critical decisions about aircraft armament, first ordering his planes loaded with general-purpose bombs for a second strike on Midway, then reversing course when American carriers were discovered and demanding that armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes be loaded for anti-ship attacks. The result was that all 4 Japanese carriers now sat with their hangar decks cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines snaking across their wooden flight decks, and aircraft spotted for launch with minimal defensive cover overhead. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading McCluskey's 2nd Division, selected the carrier Akagi as his target and dove through the morning sky. With 3 other Dauntless bombers, his 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier's flight deck near the island superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among the rearmed aircraft. The secondary explosions that followed were catastrophic, as aviation gasoline and ordnance combined to create an inferno that would rage for hours. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's bombing Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown attacked the carrier Soryu from a slightly different angle. Leslie himself had lost his bomb due to an electrical malfunction during the flight, but his squadron mates pressed home their attacks with devastating accuracy. Within minutes, Soryu was also ablaze from stem to stern, her crew abandoning ship as fire spread throughout her hull. As chronicled in Mitsuo Fukuda's personal account Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the Japanese naval aviator who had led the Pearl Harbor attack witnessed the destruction of his own carrier from a position on Akagi's bridge, describing the scene as a living nightmare of flames and explosions. The carrier Kaga, target of McCluskey's own attack, suffered perhaps the most devastating damage of all. Multiple bomb hits penetrated her flight deck, igniting fuel and ordnance throughout the ship. Captain Jisaku Okada attempted to maintain operations, even as fires raged around the island's superstructure, but within minutes it became clear that Kaga was doomed. The carrier that had participated in every major Japanese naval operation since the war began was now a floating funeral pyre Only the carrier Hiryu, positioned some distance from her sister ships, escaped the initial American attack. Rear Admiral Tama Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu's bridge, watched in stunned disbelief as three of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers burned simultaneously. The sight was unprecedented in naval warfare. Never before had so much combat power been destroyed in such a brief span of time. The psychological impact on Japanese personnel was immediate and profound. Sailors and aircrews, who had known nothing but victory since Pearl Harbor, now watched their most powerful ships dying before their eyes. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of uninterrupted success, crumbled in the space of those 6 decisive minutes. American dive bomber crews, pulling out of their attacks and forming up for the return flight to their carriers, could hardly believe what they had accomplished. Many had expected to die in the attack, following the fate of their torpedo bomber colleagues earlier that morning. Instead, they had achieved what no one had dared hope for, the crippling of the main strength of the Japanese combined fleet. The tactical situation had been completely reversed. That morning, Admiral Nagumo commanded for fleet carriers with experienced air groups and appeared poised to eliminate American naval aviation from the Pacific. Now, with 3 carriers burning and sinking, he retained only Hiryu as an effective striking force. The hunters had become the hunted, and the initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the United States Navy. As smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the clear Pacific sky, marking the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, both fleets understood that June 4th, 1942, had become a date that would be remembered as long as naval warfare was studied and commemorated. Admiral Tama Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier in the Midway strike force, and surveyed a scene of devastation that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. 3 of the Imperial Navy's finest carriers burned on the horizon, their massive smoke plumes serving as monuments to the most catastrophic defeat in Japanese naval history. Yet Yamaguchi, known throughout the fleet as one of Japan's most aggressive commanders, was not prepared to surrender the initiative without a final, desperate counterstrike. At 10:40, Yamaguchi launched 18 Aichi-Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American task force, determined to inflict maximum damage on the enemy carriers responsible for the morning's disaster. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike, knowing that this would likely be the last offensive action by Japanese carrier aviation for the foreseeable future. The irony was bitter. Japan's most experienced naval aviators were about to attack with a force smaller than the squadrons they had routinely launched during the glory days of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies campaigns. The American carriers had not escaped the morning unscathed. USS Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, presented the most vulnerable target for Japanese retaliation. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had his crew at general quarters as radar operators detected the incoming strike at a distance of 46 miles. Every available fighter was launched to intercept, but the Japanese pilots, veterans of countless Pacific battles, proved their skill one final time. At 12:10 in the afternoon, Kobayashi's dive bombers attacked through heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition. 3 bombs struck Yorktown within minutes, penetrating her flight deck and causing massive damage to her uptakes and boiler rooms. The carrier's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control teams fought fires and flooding throughout the ship. For the second time in a month, Yorktown had been crippled by Japanese bombs, yet her crew's damage control expertise would prove crucial in the hours to come. As referenced in the official U.S. Navy after-action reports compiled by Admiral King's staff, Yorktown's survival of multiple bomb and torpedo hits demonstrated the superiority of American damage control techniques over their Japanese counterparts. The Japanese celebration was short-lived. At 1:30, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, located Hiryu and began their attack runs. The Japanese carrier, caught with her remaining aircraft on deck preparing for a second strike, suffered the same fate as her sisters, for direct hits transformed Hiryu into a blazing wreck within minutes, eliminating the last Japanese striking power at Midway. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his ship was doomed, elected to go down with Hiryu rather than face the shame of defeat. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto was both a military report and a personal epitaph. Our plane scored at least 2 hits on an enemy carrier. We are preparing for a night surface attack. We are all in good spirits. The carrier sank at 9:10 the following morning, taking with her one of Japan's finest naval commanders and hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew. The tactical phase of the Battle of Midway was effectively over, but Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the operation from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, initially attempted to salvage something from the disaster. His massive battleship force still outgunned anything the Americans could bring to bear in a surface engagement, and he briefly considered a night action that might achieve through gunfire what his carriers had failed to accomplish through aviation. Reality soon intruded on Japanese hopes for redemption. Without air cover, Yamamoto's battleships would face concentrated attacks from American land-based aircraft. Throughout any daylight approach to Midway, the admiral, who had planned Operation Me as the decisive battle that would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific, now faced the bitter necessity of ordering a general retreat. At 2:55 in the morning of June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that formally ended Japanese offensive operations in the Central Pacific. Occupation of Midway is canceled. The combined fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, began its withdrawal toward home waters, leaving behind the burning hulks of four aircraft carriers and the dreams of Pacific Empire they had been meant to secure. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. America's defensive phase of the war was ending, and the long road to Tokyo was about to begin. Dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed by 24 hours of unprecedented naval warfare, where Admiral Nagumo's powerful striking force had approached Midway. With confident expectations of victory, only scattered survivors now remained, clinging to life rafts and debris in waters that had become the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation. The four aircraft carriers that had spearheaded Japan's Pacific conquests since Pearl Harbor were gone, along with more than 200 aircraft and many of the Empire's most experienced pilots. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the American task force following Admiral Fletcher's withdrawal, with the damaged Yorktown, faced the critical decision of whether to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet or consolidate his stunning victory. His choice to avoid a night surface engagement with Yamamoto's still powerful battleship force would later be recognized as tactically brilliant, preserving American carrier strength for the offensive campaigns that lay ahead. The human cost of Midway was staggering on both sides, though the losses fell disproportionately on Japan's elite naval aviators. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the Pearl Harbor attack leader, survived Akagi's destruction but suffered severe burns and would never again lead Japanese aircraft into battle. Hundreds of aircrew who had formed the backbone of Japanese carrier aviation perished in the flames of their ships or in the cold Pacific waters, representing a loss of experience and expertise that Japan could never adequately replace. USS Yorktown, though severely damaged, initially appeared likely to survive her wounds. Captain Buckmaster's crew had successfully controlled fires and flooding, and the carrier was undertowed toward Pearl Harbor when disaster struck again. At 1:36 in the afternoon of June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahashi Tanabe, penetrated the destroyer screen and fired for torpedoes at the limping carrier. As documented in Clay Blair's comprehensive Silent Victory, the U.S. submarine war against Japan, Tanabe's attack represented one of the few tactical successes achieved by Japanese forces during the Midway operation. The torpedoes struck Yorktown, causing massive flooding that proved impossible to control. The carrier that had participated in the Coral Sea and Midway battles, serving as a symbol of American resilience in the Pacific's darkest days, finally succumbed to her wounds at 5 in the morning on June 7th. The destroyer Hammond, alongside providing assistance, was also sunk by the submarine attack, adding to the American casualty list. Yet even Yorktown's loss could not diminish the magnitude of American victory. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and more than 3,000 sailors and aircrew. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 307 personnel. More importantly, Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific War, never again to regain the offensive capability that had characterized the first 6 months of the conflict. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway, recognized immediately the implications of his defeat. Upon returning to Japan, he reportedly told subordinates that Japan could continue fighting for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that ultimate defeat was now inevitable unless a negotiated peace could be arranged. The window of opportunity created by Pearl Harbor had closed permanently at Midway. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster in carefully chosen language that minimized its scope, began for the first time to question whether the war could be won. The myth of Japanese invincibility, so carefully cultivated through early victories, had been shattered over a remote Pacific atoll that most Japanese citizens could not locate on a map. American industrial capacity, already mobilizing for global warfare, received tremendous psychological impetus from the Midway victory. Factories across the United States increased production schedules for aircraft carriers, knowing that each ship launch brought the war's end closer. The names Essex, Intrepid, Hornet, and Franklin would soon be known throughout the Pacific as symbols of American industrial might and naval prowess. Intelligence services on both sides understood that Midway represented a fundamental shift in Pacific warfare. Japanese codes, partially compromised before the battle, would be completely changed, making future intelligence coups more difficult. American codebreakers, their crucial contribution to victory finally recognized at the highest levels, received increased resources and personnel for the campaigns ahead. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Australia, under threat of invasion just weeks earlier, could now begin planning offensive operations against Japanese positions in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The sun set on June 7, 1942, over a Pacific Ocean where the fundamental balance of power had shifted irrevocably in America's favor. What had begun as a desperate defensive action at a remote atoll had evolved into the strategic turning point of the Pacific War, transforming the United States Navy from a battered survivor of Pearl Harbor into the dominant maritime force in the world's largest theater of operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing preliminary battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood immediately that Midway had created opportunities that American strategists had barely dared imagine 6 months earlier. The Japanese combined fleet, stripped of its most powerful striking arm, could no longer support the far-flung perimeter that stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American planners could begin thinking offensively rather than defensively. The psychological impact of Midway reverberated throughout both the American and Japanese chains of command. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized accelerated production schedules for aircraft carriers, knowing that each new ship would bring overwhelming superiority to the Pacific Fleet. The Essex-class carriers, already under construction, would soon join Enterprise and Hornet in task forces that dwarfed anything Japan could assemble. Japanese military leaders, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, began planning defensive strategies for the first time in his career. The offensive spirit that had characterized Japanese naval strategy since the Meiji Restoration was broken, replaced by a grimmer recognition that Japan must now fight a prolonged war against an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity, as documented in the strategic assessments prepared by the U.S. Navy's War Plans Division. In the weeks following Midway, American naval planners immediately began developing the offensive campaigns that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The most immediate strategic consequence was the acceleration of Operation Watchtower, the planned invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. What had been conceived as a limited operation to prevent Japanese expansion toward Australia now became the opening move in a sustained offensive that would carry American forces across the Central Pacific to Japan itself. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, authorized the deployment of additional resources to the South Pacific, confident that Japanese naval aviation could no longer effectively contest American amphibious operations. Intelligence estimates, based on captured documents and prisoner interrogations, revealed the true extent of Japanese aircrew losses at Midway. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated Pacific skies for 6 months were irreplaceable veterans, whose loss crippled Japanese carrier aviation permanently. New aircrew, hastily trained to fill the gaps, would never achieve the skill levels that had made Japanese naval aviation seemingly invincible. During the war's early months, Admiral William Halsey, recovering from a skin condition that had prevented his participation in the Midway battle, emerged as the perfect commander to exploit American advantages. In the offensive campaigns ahead, his aggressive leadership style and willingness to take calculated risks complemented the strategic situation that Midway had created, where American industrial superiority could be brought to bear against increasingly isolated Japanese positions. The technological implications of Midway extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. American radar, which had provided crucial early warning of Japanese attacks, proved its value in carrier operations. Future American ships would be designed with integrated radar systems that gave them overwhelming advantages in detecting and tracking enemy forces. Japanese radar development, already lagging behind American capabilities, fell further behind as resources were diverted to replacing lost carriers and aircraft. Midway's impact on Allied grand strategy was equally profound. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, reviewing American battle reports, recognized that the United States Navy could now assume primary responsibility for Pacific operations, freeing Royal Navy resources for the Mediterranean and eventually the invasion of Europe. The global balance of naval power had shifted decisively toward the English-speaking democracies. Most significantly, Midway demonstrated that American industrial democracy could produce both the weapons and the warriors necessary to defeat totalitarian aggression. The pilots who dove their dauntless bombers through Japanese flag represented a new generation of Americans who combined individual initiative with collective purpose. Their victory at Midway proved that free societies, properly mobilized, possessed advantages that no authoritarian system could match. The battle's aftermath established patterns that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. American technological superiority, overwhelming industrial capacity, and tactical flexibility against Japanese courage, dedication, and increasingly desperate defensive strategies. The road from Midway to Tokyo Bay would be long and costly, but after June 4, 1942, its ultimate destination was never seriously in doubt. In the words of Admiral Nimitz, delivered to his staff as reports of the Japanese retreat reached Pearl Harbor, "Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. The way to Tokyo is now open." The defensive phase of America's Pacific War was over. The march to victory had begun.